The views and opinions shared on Taken Too Soon are those of the guest and don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the host and contributors. This podcast discusses mature themes and may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
For 6 episodes, we've retraced the steps of the investigation into Holly Strickland's murder, from the first moment she was reported missing to the private investigators who picked up the trail when official leads ran cold. In today's episode, we bring it all together: the theories, the rumors, the hard evidence, and the uncomfortable truths about how this investigation was handled.
When a murder investigation begins, the first 48 hours are crucial. Leads are fresh, witnesses' memories are sharper, and evidence hasn't yet been lost to time or weather. In the case of Holly Strickland, those first hours, and the months that followed, would be guided by one man, investigator Ronald Rausch of the Hall County Sheriff's Office. At first glance, Rausch was the face of authority for Holly's grieving family, the person tasked with bringing her killer to justice. But what most people didn't know then, and what public records now reveal, is that the man leading this investigation would himself be gone from the sheriff's office just over a year later, fired after an internal affairs probe uncovered misconduct.
We obtained those records through an open record request to the Hall County Sheriff's Office. The documents paint a troubling picture: cases without follow-up, disappearing while on call, and ultimately a termination for associating with a known felon.
The internal affairs investigation into Ronald Rausch wasn't about one bad day. It detailed a pattern: missteps, questionable judgment, and lapses that raised concerns about his professionalism and credibility. While the sheriff's office has redacted some specifics, the timeline is clear. Rausch was the lead investigator on Holly's case in early 2014. By the spring of 2015, his name appeared in disciplinary records.
In a murder case, the lead investigator's reputation matters, not just for solving the crime, but for securing a conviction. A defense attorney only needs to find one thread of doubt to pull apart an entire case. Following Holly's murder, some of these cracks were already showing, though the public didn't see them. Holly's family felt like something was off, but didn't have any official word about Rausch's shortcomings.
Early on, he would call, but he never had updates. And he would ask me, "What have you heard?" What? I'm in LJ. I'm 64 miles away from where her body was found. I thought that was kind of odd. He kept telling me the whole time he had the case, "See, this is my first murder case. See, this is my first murder case." And I had it with that. And I said, "Well, guess what? It's my first murder case, too. And I can guarantee you I don't want another one. But you're planning on making your living at doing this." And it was just unreal. And we would call and call and call. He would never return our calls. And then when he did, it was like, "I'm going to go to some prison and talk to this person and see if they know anything about it." I don't even know this person. I've never heard her mention it.
It's impossible to say how much damage this did, if any, to Holly's case, but what we do know is that a lead investigator who isn't trusted and who cuts corners can set back a murder investigation in ways that sometimes can't be repaired.
The internal affairs file on Ronald Rausch isn't a quick read. It's a slow unraveling, a series of entries that, when pieced together, tell the story of an investigator whose own actions ultimately cost him his badge. In July 2015, just 15 months after taking charge of Holly's murder investigation, Ronald Rausch was fired. For Holly's family, there was no public explanation at the time. No one sat them down to say, "The man who was supposed to fight for your daughter's justice isn't with the department anymore." But behind the scenes, it meant that the person who knew the most about the case, the one who had been there from day one, was gone. Think about what that means in a homicide investigation. Leads that were never followed up, relationships with witnesses that had to be rebuilt from scratch, evidence that needed to be re-examined because no one could be certain how it had been handled. It's not just starting over, it's starting over with less than what you had before. And the question that still haunts many people who knew Holly is this: if someone else had been in charge from the beginning, would her killer be behind bars?
Based on what we learned from former Hall County investigator Ashley Gillen and private investigators Alex and Jon Dalman, Holly's case is solvable, despite how the initial investigation was handled by Rausch.
I don't think it's one of those cases where, you just hit a dead end and there's literally nothing else to do, which, some cases can be like that. I don't think this is one of those cases.
I can say Certainly the biggest stumbling block right now is how much time has passed. There were some steps, I think, that were taken in the case that if they had been taken a little sooner, we might not be sitting here right now. So I think that's a big element to the case. If you're wondering about our opinion on what it takes to get it solved at this point, given everything that's happened, we talked about this, actually.
We did. We always talk about it. Our work never stops. Stuff never stops.
I think that definitely some people need to be re-interviewed. Even people who have been spoken with before, people we've talked to, people the sheriff's office have talked to. I think one thing that I always think of, and I heard I believe a police detective say this once, that as the years go on, loyalties change, and it's always worth going back and talking to people again, because you never know what's happened in the intervening years, and someone might flip. Someone who was loyal before might have a little beef with the person and be willing to say something that they weren't willing to say 5 years ago. So I think maybe some fresh interviews would be good.
Circumstantial evidence in their investigation points to a particular person as the most possible suspect. Each investigator chased down the what-ifs and what really happened questions in their investigations, and each have formulated theories on what happened to Holly. The Dalmans aren't your typical private eyes. They started out as bounty hunters. Chasing fugitives taught them to look for patterns, pressure points, and sometimes the smallest overlooked clue.
The very first meeting, when we were doing our initial interview, they wanted us to bring anything that we had received, from law enforcement. Well, they gave us back a necklace, and they listed it as a broken pen. It wasn't a broken pen. It was a pen they use at the jail pen. Yeah, the ones that can't be used as weapons. And since they are bounty hunters or whatever, they recognized it right off the bat.
Well, he called it a bail bondsman.
Yeah.
Because they'll bend, you can just bend them double.
They can't be used as a weapon.
Yeah.
It wasn't a pin like with the full assembled pin. If you've ever just fooling around, you've taken a pin apart, that there is a kind of flexible ink cartridge that goes into the body of the pin. And so it was just the flexible ink cartridge of the pin, just like this here. And it's so funny how this happened. So I was laying on the desk and John's looking at it, and he says, This is like a bail pen. And that is kind of how our background in fugitive recovery actually came into this case, because he recognized the pen as being something you see pretty commonly in jails. So in jails, they don't want for a pen to be able to use it as like a shank or something like that. So a lot of times the COs will take just the cartridge out because it's kind of flexible. And so you can still sign like bond paperwork or whatever with it without the risk of an inmate doing something, And he's like, this looks like a bail pen. And that would ultimately come into play later on as a piece of physical evidence.
I don't know anything about physical evidence, but I've talked to a million people. And in this case, interviewed people through Ring door cameras and everything. I mean, that's what I do. But when I saw the bail pen, I'll just refer to it as a bail pen, I was like, oh my God. It was like, I realized like just now even thinking about it, I was like, this is evidence, not property. There was nothing for her to write on. She had no reason to have a bail pen on her. Holly worked at a grocery store. There was no reason for her at all to have a flexible pen.
The pen wasn't the only detail that caught their attention. They also pushed for DNA testing on items found with Holly, her necklace, and that pen.
I want to make a huge disclaimer that we are not forensic investigators. We don't have any sort of experience with that, which is ultimately why we brought in a pro. As I mentioned toward the beginning, Jon kind of landed on this idea that this item in Holly's property could have been evidence instead of property. It was a bail pen. There was an individual associated with the case who worked in the bail bonds industry. And so we were actually able to send both the bail pen and, just for good measure, we sent Holly's necklace off as well for DNA testing through a private lab. Now, this lab works with this foundation called the Cold Case Foundation in Utah. And this particular DNA specialist is she's incredible. She's very much on the kind of the cutting edge of DNA technology and has access to some special DNA tools that a lot of police departments don't have access to, even through their, like, for example, in like the GBI may not even have access to these tools. So they were able to do DNA testing on the pin and the necklace using this system it's almost like a vacuum. So they're able to like really get more off of an item than, say, a traditional DNA test would be able to. And they found that the item, both the pin and the necklace, had DNA on them that belonged to Holly. Her DNA obviously was on both items, and then
they'd been sitting in the same bag since they got it back,
and
so
yeah,
they'd been
that's
sharing
worth
the same
noting.
container.
That they had, the pin and the necklace had been in the same bag since they were given back to Wilma. So they both had Holly's DNA, but there was also DNA found belonging to an unknown woman. To this day, we don't know whose DNA that was, but I mean, we thought that it was potentially significant that there is another woman here who seemed to have, touched either Holly's necklace or the pin, maybe both items. Again, it's hard to tell if they've been in a bag together for many years at that point. And so,
and as an heirloom in Wilma's house, it was the only item they had left their daughter of that she had on her. So it's been in a bag, but it hasn't just been stuffed away in a drawer. It gets brought out once in a while as something to remember her by. Yeah,
and on that note, they were able to eliminate the DNA of Holly's relatives as well. So
yes.
When they eliminated, when they were able to verify Holly's DNA, they were able to confirm that the other woman's DNA was not the DNA of one of Holly's relatives.
The Dalmans want those DNA samples run through every modern database possible. They believe advanced genealogy testing could finally put a name to that unknown female profile.
I would love to see the evidence items that Hall County Sheriff's Office has in their possession. I'd love to see them retested with some more advanced DNA testing tools that, I don't believe have been used on any of those items. I know from speaking with some prior investigators on the case that there are some limitations with kind of state procedures, and that ultimately I'm not speaking with absolute authority on this, just my understanding that you have to go through the GBI before, using some kind of specialized source or private lab or something like that. So, it was my understanding that the sheriff's office was up against some bureaucracy on potentially getting these items tested by a private lab that might have access to better tech. But God, I would just love to see those items be tested with some of the tech that we have now, because, who knows what's on them. I mean, if it was, the clothes that Holly was wearing, or if this trash bag or the limb or whatever did exist and were taken into evidence, it's possible that the murderer or an accomplice touched these things. I mean, who knows what could be on those items? So,
well, we'll never know as long as it's sitting in a locker somewhere in a brown bag.
So going to the DNA part of that first, there's a lot that you just said that was very fascinating, but going to the DNA part first, did the tech in that laboratory give you any information about, with the unknown specimen, if someone were to be tested, would it be possible to compare those two? I'm not as familiar with that technology, but was there anything that they can give you as information of what that might serve as evidentiary value in the future if there was someone that got swabbed or used for comparison?
Right. Yeah. And, that's a good question. I will be honest, I am not sure, because it was, the tests were run by us, if that's something that the sheriff's office would be able to use, admissibly in court. Certainly, I will say this, our DNA evidence was passed along to the Hall County Sheriff's Office, and I'm not sure how useful it might be to them, again, say in court proceedings, but certainly it could be used as a lead.
Re-interviewing people, presenting the evidence of DNA to someone. Like Alex said, allegiances change over time. When re-interviewing someone, and even though it might not be admissible in court, and say, okay, cool, let me ask you about this. Why is your DNA on this? It's valuable for that reason.
Yeah.
It might not be the smoking gun in court. We have you 9 trillion to 1 is yours. But it's probably more likely valuable in a sense as a tool for leverage or for even getting a conversation. Come on down, I want to talk to you because we have some questions about some DNA we found.
Yeah. And to answer your question, if there was a suspect that they had a DNA sample from, it could be matched or eliminated through the lab, the company that we worked with. From what I understand, and again, not being an expert in forensics at all, I've always been under the impression that law enforcement was kind of the ones who had access to CODIS and those kinds of databases. Certainly we were not able to run it through anything like that. And I don't know if Hall County Sheriff's Office had, though I did provide the report to them.
Hey, true crime junkies of North Georgia, are you aware of what's going on around you? Find out by signing up for our free newsletters from the Times. You'll get local news in your inbox daily, including at least one free article a day about what's happening in Hall County. And now back to the show.
The Dalmans' theory is blunt, and it mirrors much of what investigator Gillen uncovered in her own work. They believe Holly's killer was someone she knew, someone she expected to meet that day.
So our hypothesis is that since Holly lived with her in-laws and worked full-time, parent, everything else, she liked to take her a break and be out there on her own, on her spot outside her property, on that bucket, on Facebook, texting, calling her friends, just a moment of silence for herself. And she was expecting someone. Someone pulled up and right outside the fence line there on the road, Holly walked up the embankment to see the individual and say, hey, what's going on? And that person, whether it was an argument or an ambush or just completely unexpected, I don't know, shot Holly in the face. Holly falls backwards. The individual gets out of the car and, using gravity to their benefit, slides Holly down the embankment close to the fence line and does their best to try to conceal her with a plastic bag and a branch and that kind of stuff, and gets in their car and drives off.
We know at the time from talking with Holly's family that she was planning to move out of the Baker's house. She was going to go up with Angela to look at places to live in Ellijay and the kind of the surrounding North Georgia area where she came from in Gilmer County. Do you feel that the custody element of the fact that there's Logan and McKenna, do you feel like that played anything to do with Holly's death?
We did not feel like the custody element ultimately played into her death. A lot of times custody can definitely lead to some heightened emotions, and certainly we see that even in our current line of work, because we work with a lot of family law attorneys. But in this particular case, we didn't feel that the custody element played into to our theory at all.
There was no, it might have been some feelings going back and forth, but I don't think it was contentious enough for this. I mean, there wasn't lawyers involved or anything like that yet.
This theory matches up with what University of North Georgia assistant professor Dr. John Hager told us about the autopsy.
Well, she was shot beneath the right eye, I believe, right? Yeah. And then it fragmented. When it fragments, and when they do a radiograph or x-ray of it, it fragments, and it's something called a snowstorm. And so if you look at all the different fragments in the radiograph, and they try to retrieve all those different fragments from the projectile and then trying to figure out, is it viable for doing a comparison or not? But this one's pretty well fragmented, so the only thing they could really say was that it was a small caliber. But it did talk about how it was at a downward angle, which would suspect that, if the person was shooting from the road, it makes sense that it would be going downward into her face. And no stippling or tattooing, too, because of the distance.
Gillen, the third investigator assigned to Holly's case, also saw the same names circling the investigation. She dug into phone records, noting Holly's last call was to her estranged husband, Dusty Strickland. Another detail, Holly's body appeared to have been concealed with a plastic bag in a tree branch.
And I can't remember if this information came from Mr. Lackey or if it came from one of the investigators that we spoke with along the way, but there was a tree branch from what we understand. And again, I say this having never seen the crime scene photos myself, but from what we understand, there was a tree branch placed over the body, which was kind of wrapped in a partially or, in a garbage bag.
When you do have concealment, it does give you something to think about as far as the preparation possibly to hide a body. It takes more planning, I would say, if you decide to conceal a body and wrap it up in something, or it could be something they just had available to them. I think of all the homicides I've been to, the most violent ones were usually domestic related, whether it be hetero or homosexual. For this one, it'd be hard to say because there's just one gunshot wound. So whether or not it was domestic related or not, it's hard to say, and whether or not the concealment played a role in it. But obviously someone's trying to, when people try to conceal someone, A, they don't want someone to find it, and B, they might hope it gets to a point of decomposition where you can't recognize who they are. That's another why you conceal someone too.
Gillen believes it wasn't the work of a stranger.
One, it's just rare to have a stranger murder. It seems very common when you watch TV shows. It's just someone pops up and kills somebody and then goes about their business. But it's actually very rare that happens. Usually it's always going to be someone that they knew. And it was more of just the scenario of she wasn't robbed. Her car was still there. Her purse was still there. So it wasn't more of someone just killed her because they wanted something specific.
Personal, deliberate. Someone she trusted enough to meet in the dark stretch near her home.
Gillen agrees that this case isn't cold beyond saving. She says it's a matter of resources and willpower.
I think it's just a matter of being able to dedicate time and resources. I think that's what's important in this case.
In the end, both the Dalmans and Gillen land on the same point. This was no random act. It was someone in Holly's orbit. Someone who thought they could get away with it.
Holly Fox Strickland was 32 years old. Her murder left her daughter, her son, her mother, her sister, and all who knew and loved her with a sense of loss that will most likely never be erased. And you kind of touched on this earlier, but McKenna and Logan didn't just lose their mother. They lost each other as well. And how difficult has that been? Because from what Logan has told us, he tried for a while to keep in touch with McKenna, and it's kind of faded over the last couple of years. How difficult is that to know that they both lost not just one, but two people from their family through this whole incident?
In the space of a week, it was just all of his friends that he'd went to school with from first grade on, in the space of a week, he was in school up here. And he's give up, I think, because we know she was not allowed to call him. And if he did call her, the phone had to be put on speaker, and I don't know what they thought the two kids were going to talk about.
Well, I can speak from experience of losing a sibling. That's your first friend, your first enemy, your first everything, and it's really, really hard.
But someone, somewhere, may have the information needed to give Holly and those she loved the justice they deserve.
I think really it's just about conversations that people had with players during that time frame, or associates, friends of the players during that time frame. I think that's really just kind of, maybe people should just kind of go back and jog their memory, or try to, or look at any type of records they may have saved as far as like social media stuff from back then could be helpful.
If you have any information about the murder of Holly Fox Strickland, we urge you to contact law enforcement or email podcastadmin@gainesvilletimes.com. That's podcastadmin@gainesvilletimes.com, or submit an anonymous tip.
In our final episode of the season, we'll discuss next steps for Holly's case and the avenue Holly's family has pursued for fresh eyes on the case.
The music in this podcast was by Ben Ingram.
If you like the Taken Too Soon podcast, be sure to leave a rating wherever you listen.
This has been Taken Too Soon,
a podcast by The Times.